Welcome everyone to Raise the Roof, where worldviews get tested through open dialogue. This is our fourth episode of our 7-part series based on modern ethics in 77 arguments, a stone reader. Today I'm joined by my Christian co-host, Leroy Hill, and our atheist guest, Richard Suttles, known as the Fallen Ape Theist, to tackle Sean D. Kelly's response to the concern that atheism cannot overcome nihilism. So, in a world without, as Kelly calls it, the Judeo-Christian God, can atheism navigate past nihilism? Now, before I turn it over to the guys, I realize that some of you joining us live have been following along, you've read the article, and you're ready to go, you're primed with some questions. But some of you just joining us maybe just got busy, or maybe you're here for the first time. You don't know the article and you don't know what we're going to be talking about. So I want to help you be able to really fully engage with our conversation. So let me first tell you who Sean Kelly is and why we picked him as the framework for this discussion. So at the time Kelly wrote this article in 2010, he was a professor of philosophy and former chair of the Department of Philosophy at Harvard University. He authored numerous scholarly articles and was a co-author with Hubert Dreyfus of All Things Shining, Reading the Western Classics to Find Meaning in a Secular Age. So Kelly he's got the bona fides, he's got the background, he's an atheist, and he believes that meaning can be given to us or discovered in some way by reading classical literature. That's going to be his framework that we'll explore. So with that's the second thing I want to frame for you is his actual argument for navigating. Here's the way he outlines it. Kelly says that for the modern atheist, he doesn't need to interpret Friedrich Nietzsche's assertion that God is dead as a fatalistic black hole of nihilism. Kelly defines nihilism this way. He says that it's the sense that it is no longer obvious what our most fundamental commitments are or what matters in a life of distinction and worth, the sense that the world is an abyss of meaning rather than its God-given preserve. So God is dead, Kelly argues, in that society no longer takes belief in God as the sole foundation for finding meaning. So in effect, yes, atheism does lead to nihilism, but that is only the first stage, and there are two kinds of responses to this loss of ultimate meaning. For some, Kelly says, this change does become a destabilizing force that traps them in nihilism. For other atheists, the rejection of God opens the society up to new sources of meaning, worth, and belonging that the old Christian social order had to shut off. Kelly is unsparingly blunt and critical of what that old order actually was, which is refreshing. I'm glad to see that. He says that when Christianity held sovereign authority over society, he argues anyone who fell outside its definition of the sacred, such as the heretics, the outsiders, the different, the so-called degenerate or immoral, they were not merely marginalized, but even burned at the stake. The monoculture of medieval Christendom then purchased its sense of meaning at a brutal price, and the loss of that framework is for many not a crisis, but a liberation. So Kelly says that God is dead means that the medieval reign of Christianity is over, and now the extremists themselves, the Christians, are the ones who are marginalized. What is left is a group of suburban faithful who treat cultural conformity, political conformity as the solution to nihilism. Kelly writes, quote, "One can imagine a happy suburban member of a religious congregation who, in addition to finding fulfillment for herself and her lofty and enabling religious pursuits, experiences the aspiration to this kind of fulfillment as one demanded of all other human beings as well. Indeed, one can imagine that the kind of fulfillment she experiences through her own religious commitments depends upon her experiencing those commitments as universal, and therefore depends upon her experiencing those people not living in the fold of her church as somehow living depleted or unfulfilled lives. In short, his atheistic nihilism is the liberator of Christianity, which, based on our commitments, must be the oppressor. And while these deluded suburbanite Christians may lack the social power they once held in medieval Christianity, in Kelly's view, they still define meaning and worth by their belonging to God, which of course is by nature oppression. And so the Christian response to nihilism is still to create insiders and outsiders. Consequently, for women, racial minorities, and LGBTQIA two-spirit plus persons, although all that alphabet soup there wasn't all in his day in 2010, but still, for all those people, belief in God is not a refuge from nihilism, but just another version of Christian social violence. So while nihilism is the enemy of self-deceived suburban Christian faith, it is actually the benefit of living in a society that has killed God. So freed from the shackles of Christian standard of the good life, nihilism is the necessary and positive change that opens the door to human flourishing for all people. But Kelly warns that this hope is not a guarantee of actual hope. Pointing to various literary sources, he concedes, quote, "There is a downside to the freedom of nihilism as well. And that people living in the culture may experience this in a variety of ways. Without any clear and agreed upon sense of what to be aiming at in life, people may experience the paralyzing type of indecision," end quote. So Kelly sees freedom then from this indecision in Herman Melville's Moby Dick. The story, he argues, is a useful polytheistic model for how atheists can solve Nietzsche's fear of nihilism. Kelly writes this, quote, "In his great novel Moby Dick, the canonical American author encourages us to lower the conceit of attainable felicity, to find happiness and meaning, in other words, not in some universal religious account of the order of the universe that holds for everyone at all time, but rather in the local and small-scale commitments that animate a life well lived," end quote. So this seems to be the birdsong solution that our guest Richard has outlined in our previous episodes. But Kelly acknowledges that this atheist hope is a double-edged sword. So Ahab's maniacal pursuit of the white whale demonstrates that commitment to meaning is possible, but it's also ruinous. The throne left empty by the dead Christian God can be filled, but Kelly leaves unresolved whether any white whale we place there will save us or destroy us, like it did Ahab, whose obsession replaced reason, which led to his own destruction. Still, Kelly believes that when every person kills God, they are then free to choose their own white whale, which can maybe help them navigate past nihilism, or maybe not. Either way, Kelly does know this. There are many ways to live the good life because there are no universals, yet he also knows that there are many lives that we should not admire. And here I can only imagine that he is referring to Christian life, which he believes is universally unworthy of respect. So with that, I'm going to break in the guys, and let's start with Richard. Richard, give us a good summary. Where do you agree? Where do you stand with Kelly? Now, we've had a lot of conversations before. You can draw from those as well. But let's start with this idea. Where do you find value in what he has to say, and where do you think he goes off the rails?
I decided ahead of time there were three big points I wanted to make, two to critique him, and one to talk about how I kind of wanted to set the stage that the Christians are going to think that people who think meaning come from within, they're going to see that as bad. But I also wanted to say people who see meaning as coming from within, they see the people who think that meaning comes from out as bad. So I wanted to set the stage for that. I think his view is that this noble lie is important. He says you have to live with meaning. Kelly says you have to live with meaning. And so the noble lie is how you're going to make sense of the world. And then you do the best you can given that. That much I agree with. The issues that I had with Kelly was this idea that Moby Dick somehow addresses his view, other than that there was a ship full of different characters with different religions, which I think was the point, was Melville's point to have that. But he completely missed Ahab's zealotry. And I wanted to criticize him for that. And then I also wanted to criticize him for picking and choosing which Christian cultures to pick on. So he picks the one where you are immediately set on fire for not agreeing with the authority, as if we've had 2,000 years of that. Not realizing that most Christians today would, be horrified. 99.999% of Christians would be horrified by the idea of harming someone because they disagree with them. So he kind of picks the worst of the worst. And then his 2010 politics, when if you thought about Republicans, you thought about whatever Alex Jones was growling about. He kind of projected that onto evangelism as well. Whereas most evangelicals today are as embarrassed by Alex Jones as anyone else is. So that was my criticizing Kelly. But I do agree that we're thrown into our circumstances. We inherit our meaning world because that song is waiting on us. And so not only is it waiting on us, we're biologically postured to embrace either part of that song or all of it. And then maybe we'll convert when we encounter another meaning system, or maybe we'll be creative and we'll add something new or tweak our meaning system. But all that is waiting on us, and it does. There's nothing we can do about it. We're biologically postured to embrace it. The same way we embrace language. It's in the exact same way we embrace language. The language we're going to speak is waiting on us. So I agree that our meaning world is inherited. Leroy says it comes from God. I say it comes from our surrounding conditions.
Leroy, jump in, man. What's your thoughts on Kelly, on anything Richard had to say?
This was a very interesting discussion. I'm going to move to what Richard said before I address what Kelly said. Well, I can do both. Every person that lives on the face of the earth inherits their meaning world. They don't develop them themselves. And I think the error that Kelly makes is that he doesn't see that his whole meaning world is inherited. A meaning world is something that gives our lives order. It helps us create categories. It helps us interpret the events and features that happen in our lives. And the mistake that Kelly makes is he assumes that he doesn't have a meaning world that he inherited. I mean, imagine being born a baby. I mean, if we can remember that far, I don't know that we can. No baby makes up the social world that they're born into. Nobody does. So the error is thinking that either one of us has created the social world that we live in, or the world that gives us meaning, that we've crafted it on our own. It's inherited. I mean, every good sociologist would make that case that it's inherited. So the argument that meaning it comes from out there or meaning comes from in here, I think that just needs more clarity. The people who say that meaning comes from outside of them, what they're attempting to do is be honest about the world that they live in. And I think Kelly, one of the great things about Kelly is he was attempting to be honest about his world. And his world excludes meaning from outside of himself. But the problem with his view is he arrogates to himself without ever any internal assessment that where did his meaning world, how did he construct his meaning world? Was he the only maverick that ever lived that created their own meaning world with their own social categories? No, he got them from someplace else. His problem in his article is he never scrutinizes them. He's just scrutinizing the meaning world of others that he doesn't like. Now that gets us to this second point. Kelly's views are not new. William Lane Craig, in his book Reasonable Faith, which I suggest everybody read, it's a very good read, argues that a group of scientists got together one year because they were wrestling with the fact of nihilism and where meaning comes from and how to order their lives. And what they suggested was a noble lie, that everyone tell themselves a noble lie. This noble lie would stave off any need for any ultimate meaning, but it would provide for everyone temporal meaning. This is exactly the argument that Kelly is making. Now, Kelly would be angry that this group of people would so condescend to say that they should tell everybody that they need to create their own temporal worlds. But that's exactly what Kelly is doing here. That's precisely what he's doing. He assumes that there are no meta-narratives except the meta-narrative that there are no meta-narratives. His whole argument is a meta-narrative. So I think with those scientists, and I think this is the part that really exposes the real issue here, those scientists say that we should all make up our own noble lie or our own noble fiction that gives meaning to the very moments of our existence. Any moment, any noble lie that we create is acceptable, except one. the Christian one. Why? If the whole point, and this is my last point, and this is where the French philosopher, the wager, Pascal, that's his name, Pascal's wager. He argues that we should all, live our lives in this world as if it gives us meaning. Because if in this world, this is all there is, we get the same thing that the atheist gets, or the noble lie gets, or what Kelly proposes. We get meaning in this life, and we live our lives, and we're happy if it's a noble lie, right? But here's the problem, and here's Pascal's problem, and this is why he proposes a wager, that if in this life I get everything that I want, I get the same thing the atheist wants, but I'm not a loser, because if I'm right when I go into the next life, I get more. I get not only the meaning, I get truth, I get objectivity, I get eternal life. So I don't understand their argument. I don't understand it. I do think that it is a very truncated way to live in the world, and I think there's a better way.
Here's what my thought is on that too, and I think this is where, Richard, you're still going to be bound by Kelly's ultimate conclusions and his ultimate framing that nihilism is the thing that frees us from Christian universalism. So nihilism isn't really the enemy. Nihilism is the liberator. But you're going to have two choices moving forward: to embrace the sort of skeptical, depressive result that this brings, or just choose to find a song, or maybe you're lucky enough to be born into a song that gives you this sense of hopefulness that will allow you to move forward. But I know you resist this universal idea a little bit, but Kelly, I think, is pretty clear. And I think the distinction is universal versus particular. So whether that is internal or external doesn't matter. Whether it's the internal sense of meaning or the external song in your case, both of those are particulars. Neither of those are universals. So whether it's the particular culture or particular internal sense of meaning, they still are expressions of nihilism, in Kelly's definition of nihilism as being door that opens us to this world of great potential where all people are insiders and nobody's outsiders, of course, except for the Christians who believe that there's universals and they're still the outsiders. But we're still all doomed to this sort of world where we're left floundering to find it. And some people will and some people won't. But you have to be liberated, in his view, from the fact that there is no potential for a universal sense of meaning and value. And so the song doesn't save us from that particular interpretation, that particularist interpretation. It just moves it from the inside of the individual to the culture or to biology or to something outside of the individual, but we're still left in the same place. What are your thoughts on that, Richard?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up something, because I can see how somebody might be confused. When I talk about how people see meaning coming from outside of them, and I mean people who say that it has to come from God, and yet I've also said that this culture is outside waiting for us, a song, so that's also external to us. So in this case, external and internal isn't really a great metaphor, because in my case, it's still external too. There's this cultural song waiting for us that we're born into, but I do think we're biologically postured to embrace it. So that part, I think, is coming from within, and then how we make sense of that cultural song and what we embrace. But as for your thing for universal, remember my number one take. If I ever get hit by a truck or win the lottery and you never hear from me again, my number one take is that everybody thinks that their moral system is universal. Even the most nihilistic, nothing matters, I hate everything, even him. He says, there's no objective, there's no universals. That guy, ask him, how important is it to you that I believe you? He'll say, well, it's everything. You got to believe me. Even he thinks it's universal, that you have to listen to what he thinks. There's no escaping it. Every single person thinks their moral meaning system ought to be universal and ought to apply to everybody else. And they'll use that word, and ought to, because that's what they sincerely feel. Now, most of those people are wrong. They believe it. They're sincere, but given the law of non-contradiction, 8 point whatever billion people in the world, at least 6 billion people are wrong. They're all wrong, but they believe it and They'll take it to their grave because that's how we are as a species. Now, does that mean there is no universal system? Maybe, but maybe not. There could still be a universal system, but it doesn't do any work. That universal system, if it exists, doesn't do any work. We're all going to do whatever we're going to do, whatever we think we ought to do. So the universal could exist or not. It doesn't do any work. The work's going to come from within. That's how I see that.
Yeah. Leroy. So Richard seems to be describing the sort of Kantian divide between the noumena phenomena. Even if there is an ultimate reality, we can't know what it is. So we're left with the world we experience, not the reality of what is, even if it was there. So that seems to be there. What are your thoughts?
I think that what he is pointing toward is still something transcendent. He's saying it's not in either one of us. It's something out there, right? And if it is something out there, I mean, if we're from a Christian worldview, I can make a case for it. I can understand it. I can understand the difference between a cancer cell and another cell. I'm not speaking in terms of its ontological features. I'm speaking in terms of the meaning it provides. I mean, a cancer cell is something that needs to be eradicated because it's going to destroy humanity, right? That's ugly. But, you know, any other cell, a simple cell that is not cancerous, is just a part of, you know, a part of the world. I guess the thing that I'm struggling with from Richard's perspective is I don't think that his appeal to what's out there really tells us anything. It tells us that there's a world out there. It doesn't provide a founding or a basis for meaning. It doesn't provide a basis for beauty. It doesn't provide a basis for just or goodness. It doesn't even provide a basis for evil. It just tells us that it's out there. And then we emotionally apply based on our own inherited understanding of the world, wherever that is, or whatever that is, whatever meaning to it. But it itself, the outer framework, doesn't tell us anything about anything. It just tells us what is. And I think that's the deeper question here. And this is the question that Kelly is wrestling with. This is why Kelly can't, and Kelly is honest enough to acknowledge that even though this temporal thing that he wants to give meaning to, that he wants to, appeal to, it's only temporal because, just like Fenrir Wolf from the Norse mythology, he's inevitable. You can hold him off for a little bit, but he's inevitable. He is going to devour Odin in Norse mythology, right? Fenrir Wolf is inevitable. The wolf that you try to keep at bay with our temporal arguments, our temporal meaning, it's only good for a period of time. Even one of the gentlemen that Kelly appeals to in this book, in his article, whose writings I absolutely love. I mean, I've listened to him speak. He wrote one of his most famous talks was at a graduation called "This Is Water." I suggest everybody listen to him give that talk. His name is David Foster Wallace. In that talk, he wrestles with nihilism. He wrestles with our default setting. He wrestles with trying to find meaning in the world. And ultimately, unfortunately, he took his own life because he could give himself temporal meaning for the moment. He could even help people deal with their own frustrations with the world for the moment. He could supply relief for other people, but he couldn't supply that relief from himself. And Kelly is at least honest to say that this is where his worldview cashes out. He has no answer for Fenrir Wolf. Fenrir Wolf is coming. He's coming, and he is going to devour Odin. And what Kelly wants us to be comfortable with is that he may one day devour you. And this is the problem with noble lies and noble fictions and temporal meaning. You can give yourself meaning for the moment. Of course you can. I can look at my grandkids and find meaning in that moment. But what Kelly and what others are pressing toward is that you need something ultimate, something to ground the distinction between a cancer cell in a regular cell, that I don't just give it, right? That I don't just supply for it, right? I need something more than that. And I think that's the idea that Kelly is pushing toward. Now, what Kelly wants to do, and I think, like I said earlier, Kelly wants to cut off, and I think that shows his bias, a robust Christian worldview that can answer the question of meaning, morality, existence, origin, and destiny. He wants to cut that off by providing a fictional account, a small, truncated account that can't account for some of these questions. And I think that's where his argument falls flat, and why he chooses someone like a book like Moby Dick, you know, and all you need to do is, I mean, I remember the book, but I also remember the movie of Ahab being tied to that whale at the end and his arm flapping, saying, come with me at the end of that movie. It's a very interesting note that the director puts there. And I think that's Kelly, a dead man saying, come with me. No, thank you.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because, Richard, you said you thought he hadn't maybe read it because it's sort of a very odd choice of an ideal framework. The scary part is I think he has read it, he's taught it, and he's written books about all that, and he still chose that as the best framework for his view. So that's probably a little more scarier to me. But what I want to do is move us past Kelly a little bit, because we've set out where where we're at each in our worldview thinking, both Leroy and myself from a Christian worldview perspective, and even Richard, you from your atheist birdsong perspective, and how you think where you differ with him. So I want to just clarify where each of us are at. And I want to do this really through as I was reading through Kelly, it really struck me that there's really 7 kinds of nihilism. Now, I think he defined nihilism pretty well for the sake of his article, but there's different elements to that nihilistic framework that I think are worth teasing out. And what I want to do ultimately is just have you, Richard, when I frame this out, give your thoughts, then Leroy give your thoughts. This is less debate-ish at this point, and more just I want people to get clarity of how do each of us respond from our given worldview to these challenges of nihilism. And then people are going to have to decide, are those answers coherent? Do they correspond? Are they livable? Are they practical? They're going to have to test that worldview out. So, and we can help each other with clarifying questions and asking each other if we're not sure. But again, less debate-ish here and more just clarifying for, okay, here's where we stand. So, with that in mind, recall nihilism, at least I think there's more of a classical sense to this, or at least the historical part of this, that Kelly, we're hundreds of years past that, so there's a little bit of a different, but nihilism at some point was this response to an atheist romanticism, the assumption that humanity was morally neutral or born good, and that we would, without the constraint of God, once God was killed off, then we could progress towards this utopian existence. Society would progress towards this ideal. And the only thing holding us back was this belief in God as the universal. Well, the biggest problem for the atheist romantics was history. Their philosophy butted up against history and devolved into war and moral chaos and just this own inner sense of depression. So this led them to nihilism in the sense that I think often we took it to be the depressive nature of society, the sense of meaninglessness. Now, this is why I say that's the classic side. That led to them this depressive thing. Kelly's trying to say, well, it doesn't have to lead there. Nihilism, yes. Atheism definitely leads to nihilism, but nihilism is just the first step. So the conclusion then that with God, and that, again, in the classic sense, the death of God universals died because once each man and woman was left to their own devices and truth, they'd find their own song, they'd find their own internal sense or external, whatever it was. And I'm actually okay with Kelly's reframing of nihilism not as a necessary step in the atheist project, but not the end of the atheist project. But here's the first of the 7 I want to deal with, and that's the metaphysical nihilism. And this is what we often think of in the Nietzschean sense, the loss of a transcendent meaning. There's no God. Richard, does that metaphysical nihilism lead to existential despair in your view, your thinking?
Okay, I would say not necessarily despair, but you do recognize I'm the kind of guy that says we got to have some kind of a system. It's got to be something that we all work together. We got to be that songbird. We got to be that community of birds. We can't be by ourselves because by ourselves we will die. So we have to be part of something. I was raised in the 80s with Thomas Sowell, who's not a Christian, and he was like, you need constraints. So he was answering this atheist, take away the constraints of God and you'll flourish and be great. Thomas Sowell, a non-Christian, was like, no, you won't. You got to have the constraints. So, I was raised on that. And even though I walked away from Christianity, I never walked away from Thomas Sowell. So yeah, if you think that there's not a transcendental, the transcending universal, you might despair, but I would say take that as a warning and find your meaning. You've got to somehow find the meaning. And then I really want to push on this universal thing. And I want to talk to you both about why Christians are walking away from Christianity today in 2026. It's because of this universal thing, because they see Joe and Leroy talking about Christian universals. Then they hear them describe what Christianity is. Then they go to another church that's got a much different kind of Christians, and they're talking about universals, and they're talking about what Christianity is. And they'll say, well, the story of Jesus' resurrection was this cosmic thing that happened outside of the universe, and it was more of a metaphorical, metaphysical thing. And that doesn't really matter anyway. What matters is the idea that there's this great thing. And the great Jordan Peterson says this. They hear that, and they hear those guys saying universal, and then they're like, is there really a universal, or is everybody just saying that there's universal? And remember, my answer to that is there might be, but it doesn't do any work. It sits there and produces zero. All that happens is each person who feels that it's universal acts on it and thinks of it that way. So you guys can say Christian universal all day long, but Christians are walking away because they're not sure. And the secular world is listening to that and saying, and they're not sure. And if there is a universal, it's not that we can't know it. I'm not saying that there's no way to know it. I'm saying that it won't help. It won't step in and go, hey guys, just so you know, this is actually universal. It won't do it. So people are going to act on that. And so secular people, some are going to go away. Look, some atheists and seculars are going to become Christians too. So it's not like this is the pattern. But this idea that there's Christian universal is going to be hard to prove. It's going to be easy to feel certain about, but it's going to be hard to prove. It might exist, but it's not going to help you. You're going to have to do all the work on your own. So I do think that should worry people, and they should say, oh, now what are we going to do? And in that respect, I can see why someone would say we got to come up with some sort of meaning. I can tell you for a fact that if the three of us were on Captain Ahab's ship with our different worldviews, if we don't get on board with what he says, he's going to throw us overboard. We got to get on board to find that white whale and do our bit, whether it's being on the lookout or whether it's cleaning the other whales that we catch to eat or keeping the ship clean or navigating. We got to do what he says or we're going to get thrown overboard. So I can see why people would say we need that meaning. Is it to become a believer in Captain Ahab's white whale? Maybe. I would have a hard time with it. But at the same time, I would also know that if I was thrown into that ship, I'd better get on board or I'm going to get thrown overboard. I would imagine the only reason I would just jump overboard is if his thing was some horrific, Nazi or ISIS or Hamas thing. Then I would just jump overboard because I can't get on board with that. But I can see how people would say, if there's not a universal, I've got to be part of something. So I would be so concerned with it that I would act on it immediately. I can't say despair, but I would say this is really important. We got to do something right now.
Okay, Leroy, just by the way, I am pulling in some comments here. I am seeing them. I had that window closed. Apologies to those of you jumping in. But Scientific Spirituality 8, I do see your comments on YouTube and throwing a couple up here. He's saying that meaning exists as a thing that can be pursued, but that attempt to manufacture it are superficially useful, but are ultimately hollow. That's sort of his take that he's having a little separate debate there on YouTube about. But with that, Leroy, what's your Christian take on the metaphysical nihilism, the loss of God?
Yeah, I would say that, I guess what I've been arguing for is the view espoused by Kelly, and I think to an extent espoused by Richard, it works on some days. It works on some days. It has nothing to say when the despair arrives. It has no answers when the despair ultimately arrives. I mean, I think that's a feature and not a bug of the system that they propose. It has nothing to say when that despair arrives. It has a built-in fragility toward that despair. And I think, as I stated earlier, David Foster Wallace and people like that, they are, and I think Kelly would acknowledge, they're not an accident. That view comes with a cost. Now, I think to Richard's point, I think what Richard says is accurate in this way. People are confused. Christians are confused. But that doesn't mean that the Bible doesn't say what it says, right? The Bible can be true and say something totally different, but Christians and their leaders, which they have throughout all times, even in the scriptures, we see Christians and their leaders doing something opposite of what the Bible says. So I would agree that Christians are more and more confused. But again, I think part of that is the world that we live in. We are pulled to and fro, moment by moment, every day of the week. Our view of the world, our construal of the world is challenged at every moment. And I would call that challenge the challenge of pluralism. You live in the most technologically affluent society, in one of the most pluralistic societies in the history of the world. And that technological affluence and pluralism pulls at any one ultimate claim. Ultimately, it pulls at any one ultimate claim. It attacks it ferociously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But that doesn't mean that ultimate claim isn't true. It may mean that the people who are trying to answer or find answers aren't looking in the right places, or for many people, they've settled for a domesticated or a truncated Christianity that can answer no questions, that must exceed. And even Richard's point is those people who are pursuing a Christian faith in the world that accepts the LGBT claims, that accepts moral degradation, that accepts all of these insane views of the world, are not living in a Christian world. They're living in a social world that has a Christian influence. In other words, the core feature of that world are cultural, the social cultural framework. The social cultural framework tells people what's culturally acceptable, what's culturally normal, and what's culturally true. And you have millions and millions of Christians throughout the world that live in that socially construed world. And for them, they are attempting to make sense of the world. Now, what I would suggest that those people who are living in that way are not pursuing robust biblical Christianity. I think they've settled for a truncated view. And from people looking on the outside, I would conclude the same thing, that it's muddled, that it's confusing. But again, that doesn't mean that that what it says isn't true. Generally, what's happened is people have rejected what's true. They've rejected the truth of Scripture and are attempting to make it up as they go along. I think that's a common feature.
Yeah. We've definitely moved forward a little bit, which is okay because these all bleed into each other at some level. But outside of the metaphysical nihilism, that does open the door, somewhat you're saying there, Leroy, to epistemological nihilism, the idea that loss of knowable meaning, that even if it's there, it's hard, we can't know it. And that opens the door to what would be a very radical skepticism. At least that's how the Christian worldview would frame it. So, Richard, how does your worldview prevent that sort of epistemological skepticism that seems endemic to atheism?
Okay, and this is the second one, right? The
Yeah.
epistemic nihilism is the second
Yeah.
one. Okay, all right, good. Just making sure I'm tracking.
Yeah.
I was a Marine.
I saw
so
you
gotta
phoning
have
a friend over there. He's been texting, so he's getting help from friends. I see that. I'm just messing with you.
Uh, Actually, I'm texting because I want to take notes because Leroy's brought up four things that I want to bring up. So I'm texting myself. Yeah, I need all the help I can get. But okay, in terms of epistemic nihilism, I don't know that something is unknowable. I can say that I don't know it. And when I watch, going back to this Christian saying there's a universal and they disagree with each other, I can say what they're doing, this observation of their epistemic disagreement, does not mean that there's no ontological truth out there. It just means that ontological truth is just going to watch. It's going to, as an observer, let them argue and or kill each other and or get past it and or die of cancer. It's not going to step forward and say, hey, this is the answer. For whatever reason, perhaps for amazing reasons. So I don't know that something is unknowable, but just like losing transcendental meaning, if it's not universal, I would start to worry. I would start to say, I've got to get busy. Maybe I would get inspired and start doing some work. Same thing for epistemic. I don't know that it's unknowable, but I know that I don't know it. And when I hear Leroy's Christian answer, give him hope, and then I hear Progressive's Christian answer, give him hope, then I say, okay, that doesn't mean, even though they contradict each other, that doesn't mean there's no correct answer to this. It just means that Leroy's going to go this way to his grave, and this progressive person is, statistically speaking, going to go this way to his grave. One of those guys is going to find out if Christianity is true. One of those guys is going to find out. But at the same time, they're going to live their whole lives, and they've got kids and grandkids, and they've got things to do, and they're going to have meaning. So they're going to have to embrace something. That gives me, reason to worry, but I don't want to despair and I don't want to panic. I see that as unhelpful. In my life, there's been times where I said, do I despair and just start freaking out, or do I try something? So I do that with my worldview as well. I don't know that there's a way to know epistemic meaning that's knowable by everybody. I don't know that that's going to be a thing. So I say find your own, even if it is a noble lie. And remember, I think that you guys are doing something like a noble lie, except that you don't think it is. You would agree with me that the diehard Muslims and Hindus don't think that they're living a noble lie, but they are living something that's not true. I think you guys are living something that's not true, but you genuinely and with your whole heart, I almost said soul, you really think that that's what it is. So it's not a lie, but it's the same ontological level of truth as me coming up with an ontological lie. It's not true, if I'm right, if I'm correct. So I think we're all doing it. It's just some people say, okay, this is a noble lie, and some people say, no, I'm telling the truth, but they're still doing the same thing. And then it just matters what you do from there.
So, Richard, I think this question is for you, if I'm not mistaken. There's a little bit of philosophical jargon here, so you may need a clarifier. But the question is, how do you see non-provisional methodological naturalism? It seems as if it is semantic elimination rather than the pursuit of truth, like provisional methodological naturalism. So do you understand that question that's being asked for your view, or do you want something to clarify?
Yeah, I don't even understand 3% of that.
But there's a lot of jargon there. I think what's being asked, if I'm understanding the question right, is, are you not just playing a game of semantics? I think is what's being asked. Are you not just saying, well, you're using the same word meaning, but it's provisional meaning, there's no durable sense to that meaning. And so your methods are limited to observation of the world, very practical things, but it's sort of in the sense of like we have the assumption in science that you can only use natural methods. You can't assume anything supernatural. And aren't you sort of doing that in an epistemic way? You're just limiting yourself to only the natural answers, and then it's sort of a semantics game. That's my best understanding of that question. So if I'm screwing it up, I apologize to the questioner, but I did my best.
Well, I do want to say I'm open to the supernatural. Like, if you want to convince me that there's some kind of a God, you might do that today. I might change that right now. I'm really not fighting that there's some kind of supernatural or some kind of God. What I do argue is that I think we come up with our own meaning systems, often in the forms of religion, and that if there is this God who made us all, and we owe him our existence, he's not making it clear to all of us in a way that's universally clear to do what we're supposed to do according to his rules. That all that clarity and certainty comes from us only. and he's going to sit and let us, and perhaps for wonderful reasons, he's going to let us kill each other or not over it. And so who am I to challenge our creator if that's how he's going to be? But that is how he's going to be. So I don't know that everything has to be natural. Instead of saying naturalism or materialism, I say, what does reality have to offer? And if reality has to offer God or supernatural forces, great. I'll embrace that and I'll go with the show. So I'm not one of those guys that says, no matter what, there can't be supernatural. I won't allow it. I'm open to it. All I'm saying is that when someone says, hey, God wants me to tell you this, I'm like, well, maybe not. Because statistically speaking, you're going to be wrong. Just given the law of non-contradiction, statistically speaking, there's a 75% chance that you're definitely wrong, that what God is telling you right now is what he wants me to know. So I just keep that in mind. I do think, though, that meaning is terribly important, and I think you have to believe it. Like in the same way that I love my kids, I need to love an idea just that much. It needs to wake me up in the morning. Like for this podcast, I got up, I remember the hazy shades of morning at like 6 a.m. And I'm like, what am I going to do? Go for a jog, go to the gym? And I was like, oh, the podcast. And I jumped up and I went to my app to talk to the studio manager here. And I'm like, yeah, I got the podcast. And I started getting my videos ready for Sean Kelly, and I had a pep in my step. So I think you've got to have meaning, and it's got to affect you the same way the love for my family affects me. It's got to happen. And if it's made up, fine, I don't care, as long as it gets you working. What you do is what's going to be measured, not whether it's made up or not, because all the people who are believing obviously false things, but they're getting work done, that work is getting done.
Okay. Leroy, your response to epistemic or the skepticism or nihilism?
I'm amazed because if you listen to Richard well, he argues for Christian values and Christian morality. They're all borrowed. He does not argue from the worldview that he's espousing. He's not arguing from that worldview. That worldview that he's espousing, it's rugged. It absolutely is rugged. It provides some meaning, but it cannot account for goodness. It's everything. And I think that's the questioner's point. It's just what I want. It's just, I want goodness here. I want to get up in the morning and have meaning for my life. But his worldview just tells us that there's something there. I mean, I respect him. And I think that, what he's saying is meaningful. I think that he's really reaching out for something, but he cannot account for beauty.
Let's jump into that. Let's jump to the next one, and I'll start with you, and then I'll let Richard give the response to that. So, aesthetic nihilism. So we've gone from epistemic to the aesthetic. Aesthetic nihilism is the loss of objective beauty that opens the door to what I would call a provocative transgression. So the only way to find meaning is to transgress the social norms or transgress whatever has been defined as beauty, and it has to be a provocative transgression. I think that's where atheism naturally leads, and I think that's what you're opening the door to. So explain that a little bit, Leroy, and then we'll flip it this time, and Richard, then you get to kind of give your atheist response to that aesthetic nihilism.
Yeah, the real key here is those things that make life meaningful. If I accept the view that Richard is espousing, if I'm a progressive, I get to make it up. If I'm a Christian, I'm for all intent and purposes making it up. There's no real beauty anywhere. There's no real good anywhere. There's just 8 billion, or how many people there are in the world, different expressions of it. And there's nothing really ultimate. Now, Christians have argued for a long time, and not merely Christians, but Jews as well, that there is a real beauty. There is a real goodness. There is a real justice, even if in the world we don't find it. And again, the Christian worldview gives us a perspective as to why the world is in the shape that it is. There is a fall. There was a goodness. There was a justice. There was a beauty. And man was placed in that place, in that relationship with God and in the garden. And because man chose to set up on his own, as C.S. Lewis would argue, the result is degradation, dysfunction, disdain, dis-ease. I think the Christian worldview accounts for what really is. Now, we talked about aesthetic beauty being grounded in God. If aesthetic beauty is grounded in God, then there is a place for it. I just need to open up the scriptures and read what it says, and then see if what it says about man is true, right? And if it's what it says about man is true, that's an inkling. That doesn't tell us that word itself is totally true, but there's an inkling that it's pointing us in a direction that things can be, that corresponds with reality, the way that it is, not as the way that I wish, but the way that it is. And that's the first jump. That's the first step, right? That's the first bridge. That what it says corresponds with the way things really are. That's telling me that it's saying something about the world that I can actually grab onto objectively. And then when it explains man and all of his degradation and all of his lust and all of his, sin and the horror that results from that, it doesn't place responsibility for it outside of ourselves. It places responsibility right here. I am responsible for the way things are. And if there is a God, right? If there is a God, then he says, okay, you guys have made some choices. And because I love you, I'm going to let you live out those choices. But those choices are not consequence free. If I do good, then there are consequences that follow from it. Sometimes good, sometimes bad.
All right, Richard, what about the aesthetic nihilism, and what in your worldview, how does it create a boundary so that beauty isn't just simply defined by that sort of provocative deconstruction of whatever else people say is beauty? How do you navigate that?
Okay, well, I'm going to concede a lot of ground here. So, to all the atheists, if you're watching now or in the future, I apologize because you're going to about to get mad at me. I do think there's objective beauty. Now, remember, I said that everybody thinks that their moral system is objective and that they're probably wrong, but they're just going to keep thinking it. So, you could be saying that I'm doing the same thing for beauty, but I really do. Like, I went to summer camp at a summer Baptist summer camp every year of my childhood from 7 to 18. And when we went out to the mountains in North Carolina and looked at all the mountains, it was just overwhelming. I just would sit there and just be overwhelmed. And of course, our counselors would say this was all God's work. I had no questions. That sounds perfectly fine to me. So I do think of beautiful landscapes, order, things that are organized. I see all that as beautiful. A symmetrical face. I see all that. It's just beautiful. And is it objective? It seems that way. And so I absolutely just sign off on that and go with it. I also see like communities that are doing well, even if it's a fictional community. I see that as beautiful. So to respond to what Leroy said, that I'm borrowing from God, okay. And in fact, I always say, remember in our earlier show, I always say, I don't even preach atheism. I say, be like Charles Ingalls from Little House on the Prairie, and how my biological dad told me when I was a kid, when Little House on the Prairie was on, he would say, okay, I haven't been a good father, but this guy is a good father. Be like Charles Ingalls. I teach that today, 50 years later. I teach what my dad taught me. Be like Charles Ingalls, who was a Christian. He is a TV show. He was a conservative Christian man based on an actual conservative Christian historical figure, and I'm telling people to be like him, even as a non-Christian. So if you want to say that I'm borrowing from God, that's my ministry. I'm taking this idea, this concept, and I'm using the word ministry and going around and saying, yeah, I think you should be like this. This is what I think it should be, whether it's universal or not. I think it ought to be, and I think more people should be like this. So I'm guilty of that. If it's not a real thing, then I'm borrowing from something that was made up. But if it is a real thing, then I'm borrowing from something that's real. But it is my meaning. It's what gets me going. So if that's what I'm doing, then I admit to it. And if it's true, I'm going to hell anyway. So I might as well admit that's what I'm doing. And I also just want to clarify real quick. Accountability is everything from both sides. Sean Kelly, when he did his Lex Friedman thing, it all kept going back to accountability, because he was saying, if you're doing this because you think this is the standard, this fixed standard by which God is telling you to do it, then you're not really taking responsibility for your actions. You're going by his standard. That's Sean Kelly's view. So notice that Sean Kelly is like, look, I just want you to think about accountability. And notice that Leroy was like, look, I just want you to think about accountability. We have to behave as a society where we hold each other accountable, whether God is telling us to do it or these wild cultural fleeting things are telling us to do it. Whatever's happening, we have to hold each other accountable, which is terrifying. But if we don't do it, we're going to fall apart. So it is all about accountability.
Okay, if what Christianity is saying is true and worth living, then the consequences of that are is a beautiful life, as you express. But Christianity also says that if you live opposite to that, the consequence of that is depravity. And I think that's what we see. It's depravity. That's the first thing. And the second point is accountable to who? To ourselves? 8 billion people being accountable to themselves is 8 billion different forms of accountability, which means there's none. There's really none. If I'm a murderer and I'm a killer, and there are men and women who are like that, then if I'm accountable to myself, I'm going to get busy being accountable. The result is still, and this is the part about the world that I was talking about that you want to instantiate. It doesn't deal with the consequences of those decisions. It just tells us that, that there's something there, and it doesn't want to go that next step and say that there are consequences for that. So it goes back to our original point. You're not really giving us anything to ground that accountability and that meaning in. We just get to make it up. And I don't see any difference on that view of the guy who wants to be a mass murdering leader, dictator, or the person who wants to live like Charles Ingalls, other than the fact that I happen to prefer one over the other.
Some people like Moby Dick, some people like Charles Ingalls. It's a crapshoot, whichever one works out the best. So here's what I think is interesting. And although I've divided out these things into 7, what I'm getting through our discussions, what I imagined would take place too, to some degree, because that word nihilism is doing a lot of work in different areas, but all of those areas cross over. And that's why a consistent worldview is so important. If the worldview breaks down because we're forced to borrow from other worldviews, then that's telling us that something is amiss in the very nature of what we're arguing for. So the other ones I would argue are anthropological nihilism. The loss of a fixed human nature opens the door to an identity crisis and the fragmentation of self. I think that's where we see a lot of our society in the LGBTQI, Two-Spirit Plus, all that sort of thing. We don't have a sense of what makes us. We've dealt with some of these in past programs, so I don't want to necessarily have to retread some of that ground. I encourage people to go listen to some of our previous discussions. We've talked a lot about the moral nihilism that I think comes of this. The loss of objective moral meaning opens the door to utilitarian reductionism and in some cases hedonism. And we can then, as Leroy said, and both of you said, Richard, even borrowing from that Christian worldview idea that, well, I want to resist these sort of things because it's a barrier to my view or my song or however it is, but we want to navigate that somehow. And the question is which worldview can actually fulfill what we all long to have happen. And the last 2 nihilisms were political nihilism. The loss of institutional meaning opens the door to revolutionary cynicism and terrorism. I think we're in that sphere right now. Richard, that's a bone to you we'll throw here in a second, because I think that's your whole world that you live in with counterterrorism. And then social nihilism is the loss of relational meaning, opens the door to isolation, and then ultimately balkanization. That is just, we become tribalized, either radical individualism or radical tribalism. And of course, that crosses over to the political side as well. So given those last couple, especially, and again, they are blending together, Richard, I'll come to you first. That's your wheelhouse, the political side, especially the social side that you deal with. Thoughts on how your worldview, can within your worldview, without drawing from a Christian one, resolve those tensions in any meaningful sense?
Well, I can tell you how I had my own coming to Jesus moment, even though I don't believe in him as supernatural. One of my big meaning moments was in counterterrorism. So I've been doing this for 31 years. And I was seeing all the terrible things that the terrorists have done since 1994. And, certainly they've been before that, but that's when I got into the game, 1995. Somewhere in that, after watching that for years, we also read their justification. I have never heard the moral argument more than from terrorists. They use the same arguments that William Lane Craig uses. They say, hey, there's got to be something. First of all, there's got to be something out there. It's fine tuning. There's got to be a morality. It's got to be objective. They use the same things. And then they say, because of that, these feelings that you feel that we're doing something wrong, that's your emotional, corrupted, evil side that actually seems like it's good, but you don't know the true standard. So I can't tell you how many times I rolled my eyes after watching somebody do these horrible things, reading their stuff saying, hey, man, it's all about morality. So I said, okay, people can use this meaning and morality to do awful things. I'm just not going to do that. So rather than using from God, I'm going to use from what these terrorists said. They would say it was Allah. Uh, we'll use that. They said, hey, Allah wants me, and look, I'm not an Islamic scholar. They said Allah wants us to do these horrible things. And I said, I'm just not going to do that. I'm going to be the opposite of that kind of person. And, that kind of made me inspired and think about this Charles Ingalls concept that my dad had showed me. That was my big moment. I was like, I'm just not going to do that. I don't care how they're trying to make this case about how this is actually based on an objective standard. I'm just not going to do it. That's going to be who I am. And if I'm wrong, God help me. I'll pay for that later. But that's not who I'm going to be. So because of that's my meaning, that just kind of drives me. That gives me my purpose. And I think everybody should have that. And remember, I said in an earlier show, we're in a battle. This is a battle for, are you going to use your meaning to be more like a cooperative person in a community, but who also has standards? I don't mean cooperative in that if ISIS comes in, I'm like, well, hey, let's cooperate. I'm cooperative in that, hey, we have different worldviews, but we have to build this church or we have to build this farm. So we cooperate for that. And then ISIS comes in and says, you need to do what we say or we're going to start torturing you. We all band together and get rid of those guys. So you've got to have your cooperation within people who are productive and helpful. And then you've got to be a badass for people who want to cause grief. You show them the grief that they search for. And if they're so eager to get to heaven and show off, then let's help them along. So that's who I am, and that's what gives me meaning, and that's what gives me drive. Is that from something universal? I don't know, but I think it is, and it's what keeps me moving. And I hope that more people are like me than are like those other guys. And so that's what I preach, whether it's universal or not. That's what I meant. So as Leroy was saying, well, that it's all just made up and anything can happen. Yeah, anything could happen. I could lose. The people who are like us, we could lose. We could lose out to people like that if we're not careful, if we're not doing what we're supposed to do, and if we're not being protective and we're not leading from the example about how great this kind of life is. If we're not doing that, we could lose, and then it would all be gone. In my worldview, humanity could disappear, could just dissolve off the earth, and the earth would keep spinning. That's something that could really happen. So that drives me more than the idea of heaven or hell. The idea that we could ruin ourselves and the earth keeps spinning, that drives me even more than being punished or tormented for eternity. That's just how I see it.
Yeah, so Richard seems to express there, Leroy, the sort of political nihilism, social nihilism in terms of the tribalist perspective. One man's terrorist is another man's liberation fighter, as the old saying goes. And he just wants to be aligned with his liberating people from those his group would define as terrorists, but there's no universal there. It's just which is best for my group. It seems to be the answer there. How does the Christian worldview address that?
Well, there's a difference between William Lane Craig and the terrorist. William Lane Craig wants to see human flourishing. The terrorist wants to see some humans flourish, right? There's a difference. Again, I point back to the Christian worldview, which tells us that human beings are valuable and of inestimable worth. Gives Christians a reason to treat all people, to not show favoritism or be partial. That each person is made in the image of God and is valuable and worth loving because God loves them. From a Christian worldview, it's going to cause me to try to love and listen, even to people who don't like me, to treat them fairly and to treat them justly. There's no reason for treating anyone good or loving anyone or caring about anyone or caring about whether humans flourish apart from the fact that it's just what I prefer. Now, if it's just what you prefer, that's no different than the terrorist who wants to wipe out everyone because they prefer a world that fits their particular construal of that world. I think on that view, both persons just prefer what they prefer. Now, we Christians would prefer one over the other, but we have a reason for that. I don't see how in the other worldview, or the worldview, the nihilistic worldview, or the worldview where there's nothing outside of ourselves to which we owe accountability and ability to, apart from ourselves, to prefer either one. I mean, it's just the way that things are. So on a Christian worldview, I have reasons to love everyone, to care for everyone, to even protect and defend people. On the other worldview, I think that because there's no foundation for goodness, justice, righteousness, apart from what I give it, I mean, what's the difference between killing them or eating them or saving them, apart from the fact that that's what you prefer? Now, that seems absurd. I know that it sounds absurd, and I don't think that that's where Richard, I think if you listen to Richard really well, Richard is still working off of a Christian worldview. I mean, he acknowledges that he's borrowing for that worldview to give meaning to his life. I just think that why borrow and not have the real thing? I mean, borrowing, like you said earlier, it simply shows that the worldview that we're espousing can't provide what we need. So I would say the Christian worldview can provide what we need. The other worldview leaves us with 8 billion preferences and no ability to choose between which one, apart from which one we like.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that at least sets out for folks the distinction of where we are in this concept of nihilism, how we differ, how we think our worldviews can successfully navigate that challenge. And I think everyone's had a good chance to lay that out. So with that, let me just ask for some closing thoughts. Richard, I'll come to you first, then Leroy, you on your closing thoughts of what's your big takeaway from this entire discussion on navigating past nihilism.
Here's what I love about Leroy. Let's say we're in a village and there's an army standing outside that village. And the army says, hey, inside this warehouse are 3 guys. And those 3 guys are going to fight it out. And whichever person comes out, or whether it's all 3 of them agree, or just 2 or 1, whoever wins that battle inside that, we're not even going to go in there. Whoever emerges from that garage, he's going to tell us what to do. We're going to go into the village and we're going to do that. We don't care. We're all AI. We're just going to follow orders. So inside that garage, I walk in and there's Leroy, and then there's another Christian. And the other Christian says, we're going to go into each house and we're going to tear everything out. We're going to line everybody up and we're going to make them agree to Christianity the way I say it. And then we're going to have soldiers live inside each house, and he's going to make absolutely sure everyone does what I say. And this is the way things are going to be. And I don't care if they flourish. I want them to obey what I think. And this is the Christian way. I'm going to be so relieved because I know that Leroy and I are about to kick this dude's ass. And we're going to walk out there and we're going to go tell this army, hey, we're going to go help build things. We're going to make sure everyone's flourishing. We're going to have standards that you can't kill each other. We're going to have a very Walnut Grove type village. I already know that's going to happen. Now, Leroy will say, well, of course, that's the Christian way. I'm going to say, well, okay, this is what I think also. But we're both, it's not just a preference. We're both committed. And we don't just think, yeah, let's just do this. We're like, no, we're definitely going to do this. If this table was more sturdy, I would be banging it. With its meaning and its morality, it's fierce, and it's more than just preferences and opinions. And I know that Leroy and I are so committed that we're going to kick this dude's butt and go out there, and this village is going to be in good standing, because there's no way that he's going to convince Leroy that the Christian way is to do what he said. But there are Christians like that who say this is the Christian way. So no matter whether you're a Christian or an atheist watching the show, you're going to, if you haven't already, you're going to see Christians like Leroy talking about the Christian way, and you're going to see Christians like what I'm talking about the Christian way. Maybe not that hyperbolic, but you're going to see a lot of panic and a lot of devastating and damaging behavior and mindsets claiming that this is the Christian way. Is there really a Christian way? I don't know. But I do think it's measurable that a town or a village can either value human flourishing and still have standards, or whether they're trying to force everybody to do things their way or destroy them. I think that's measurable. And so for me, that's an objective goal of sorts. Whether it's objective versus subjective or not, you can tell me. But I do think it's measurable, and I do think it's important. And I'm glad that Leroy and I agree, at least in that approach.
All right, Leroy, close us out with your thought.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting hypothetical. I think it's one that Jesus was offered, though. If you will bow down to me, I will give you the kingdoms of the world, right? That was the offer that Satan made, to Jesus, that if you bow down, he's going to give you everything that you can see. I don't think that I think that I would have to be like Jesus, where he said, if my kingdom were of this world, then that's what my servants fight. I don't think that Christians ought to respond in the way that you describe in that situation. The reality is, and here's where I think you're right, some Christians would respond in that way, where they would kill someone in order to see the Christian worldview flourish in the world, right? I mean, I think that unfortunately you're 100%, 110% right, that there are people who claim the name of Christians who would absolutely do that. I'm not one of those people. And because I understand that Christianity does not depend on me, that there is a character, there's a manner, there's a way of life that I am called to live, and sometimes even die in order to instantiate. And again, I want to say something here because I think this is valuable. You're gesturing toward, imperfectly, something good, something true, and something beautiful. I think that you are. I've said that a number of times in our conversations, that you are gesturing toward something. But I liken it to what Paul did when he was in Athens. Paul entered into their worldview in Athens, the Athenians, not for the purposes of agreement, but to affirm what is affirmable, to correct what is distorted or disordered, to stretch out what is reductionistic, and then to offer them truth, which is that Christians are not merely saying something that we hope is true. We're saying something that we believe is true, and we're saying something that other Christians who have come before us have seen demonstrated, which is that Jesus Christ was raised from the dead. The resurrection is true. Now, if the resurrection really did happen, that Jesus Christ did die and was raised from the grave, then Christians have a basis for building their life on. Even if we lose everything in this world, we have a basis for building our life on. And that's the claim of the scriptures. That's the claim of those people who have gone on before us. That's the witness that we were left with. That's the witness that we proclaim. That Christianity is not merely a set of ideas that we agree to. It is something that is true, that actually happened in history, and that we who proclaim it today are only proclaiming and agreeing with our brothers and sisters who have gone on before us, who actually saw it, who actually saw the risen Lord. And if that is true, then I don't need to kill someone in order to see, Christianity flourish on the earth. There's a God in heaven who will ensure, who promises us that Christianity will thrive, that in the end, his way will win. And I think if I hold on to that, because it's true, not because I merely wish it to be true, everything will work out. Everything will be all right in the end. And that gives me hope. And I don't have to worry about Fenrir Wolf or the Wolf of Despair attacking that. No, I can actually make sense of the world.
All right. Well, I want to say thanks, gentlemen, for joining me live on this show. Appreciate all that you have brought to this conversation. And my closing thought actually is really on Kelly's arguments. I read his argument, which I actually really appreciate him as a philosopher. I think he's very consistent. I think he's clear in defining things. We've been critical of other atheist philosophers who we've used to work through these episodes because they weren't clear, but I do appreciate his clarity and his consistency. But as I read, I was reminded of something, and this might be a fun takeaway for everybody in terms of something you could do to follow through. So on my site, morethancake.org, if you go there, search up an article called Lessons from Pleasantville. Pleasantville is an old movie, I believe it was in the early 2000s, if I recall. I always get my 90s and 2000s blurred at this point. But in this movie, there's the Nietzschean god of Pleasantville is portrayed by Don Knotts. And so he's this god of this fictional town who's very much like the God of Nietzsche, who by the end of the movie is very much dead. And so, of course, Nietzsche writes about this in The Gay Science, and thus spoke Zarathustra. Well, when this main character in this idea, who's the feature character, Bud, turns off his TV. And if you don't understand these references, you just got to watch the movie. It'll make more sense. But Bud turns off the TV in the end. There's this, he turns it off, and then there's this final scene. Where all these different scenes take place and you don't know what's happening. It's brilliant cinematography. But he's demonstrating, when he turns this off, to the viewer the collapse of the Christian God, and the central pillar of meaning, morality, and truth has just all been done away with. And everybody now gets to invent their own reality and create their own future. And this Nietzschean God, he was created just really to fulfill human need and human order. But now that he's been done away with, again, everybody can pursue their own purpose, their own truth, their own values. And the movie Pleasantville, I think, reflects well both Kelly's worldview, atheism, and I think Richard's view of atheism as well. Although they have their own differences within them, I think the movie is a pretty good expression of that. So anyway, find that out and watch the movie. I have a study guide that goes with that. Scene by scene breakdown might be pretty useful for you if you want to do a study on these concepts through analyzing a movie. Well, I want to say thanks to everyone for joining us, and I want to encourage you to go out and raise the roof on nihilism by starting your own conversations. Again, maybe with that movie Pleasantville, with your friends and family. And then in the meantime, please take a moment to rate the show on your favorite podcasting service and connect with me at morethancake.org, where subscribers, you can post comments and ask questions. That's how I keep the trolls at bay. And I want to encourage you to join us next month. We'll explore the atheist economics and the morality of the free market versus the morality of redistribution. So that will be a fun one. I think Richard's going to have a lot to say about that. And it's going to be interesting to see where we agree or disagree and how our worldviews shape that understanding. So thanks for joining us. God bless everybody.